Yeah, another story. Well, looking forward to meeting you in Seattle.
Hmm.
Let's start the conversation here. We're talking with Cassandra. How do you say your last name? Vieten?
Vieten, yeah, yeah, you got it.
Mhm. And you'll be one of the presenters at the sixth annual Architects of the New Paradigm Conference at Accessing Advanced States of Creativity and Innovation. And the
Mm.
conference is in Seattle, March 21st, 22nd. And Cassandra, you're a psychologist, a mind body medicine researcher, author of articles in scientific journals, and your lecture at this conference is entitled The Art and Science of Imagination. And anybody who knows me knows that I'm going to be sitting in the front row. I love that title. I love that theme. Let us know what you're going to talk about.
Well, great. Yeah, I have been lucky enough to have a very interesting career looking into the field of consciousness in a number of different ways. And my early career was in the field of addictions, where I was working with what kinds of states of consciousness people needed to reach in order to recover from addictions. Um, and that brought me into the field of mindfulness, where I was looking at how people could both stay aware of their internal experiences so they didn't forget what their long-term goals were, in sort of sacrifice their long-term goals for short-term being triggered by something, and also be able to navigate or tolerate the ever-changing inner experiences. And so I did a lot of mindfulness research. Then I moved on to looking at the kind of the larger picture of how people change their consciousness, and worked at the Institute of Noetic Sciences for about
Okay.
18 years, looking at how people transform their consciousness to be able to, again, sort of navigate more seamlessly between the what we call the noetic world, which is a word that is Greek. It means the inner form of knowing, or inner wisdom, intuition, creativity, imagery, dreams. One of the ways we described it was information not limited by conventional notions of space and time. And so, what we found was that people would have these experiences in meditation, or in religious or spiritual practices, or movement, martial arts, these traditional practices that go back millennia, and they would be able to access ways of thinking about the world and pieces of information that were helpful to them that they couldn't access any other way. And so now that I'm a senior fellow at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and I've moved to San Diego, I'm working as a scholar in residence at the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination. And that is really about what is the neuroscience of imagination? What are tools for cultivating imagination? And how can we use what we call speculative culture? In other words, the art of speculation, how we think about the future, how we think of possibilities that maybe don't even seem possible right now. So we host a summer workshop for science fiction writers. Obviously, Arthur C. Clarke was the inspiration for the center, who not only wrote a ton of very popular science fiction, but inside of that science fiction actually, um, in a way, invented or saw forward in time to things in science and technology that were decades away from being invented. And so, what I'm going to talk about at the conference is how can we each utilize various states of consciousness to tap into the imaginal realm inside of ourselves, both individually and as a part of teams.
Well, I think for a lot of people who haven't studied this, imagination is kind of seen as almost like being lazy. It's like daydreaming, and
Yeah, yeah.
maybe one get an idea, but I think what you're saying and what I've certainly found is that imagination is a very powerful force. And I'd love you to say a little bit about the arising of intention experiments, Lynn McTaggart's work,
Mm-hmm.
and the whole idea of focusing imagination, imagining the future. You're
Mm-hmm.
there already. You're looking backwards. I love the science side of that because otherwise it gets a little bit woo-woo-y. So give
Yeah.
us a little bit of validation for that stuff if you can.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that just like some other states of consciousness, imagination has been sort of stigmatized in a way. You think of it as imaginary, which, sort
Right.
of by definition means not real or not important, or not relevant. And it's sort of yeah, you picture somebody sort of staring off into space, imagining things that could never happen.
Right.
And I think what I'd like to propose is that imagination is actually a core competency, and it is the seed of all innovation, all invention, and in a very real way, it spurs human evolution toward a more sustainable and thriving world. And so, when we are schooled, at least in Western society, you're almost trained out of imagination. You think of how many multiple choice exams are we given to determine how intelligent we are. And
Yeah.
that sort of relies on there are only four choices. And to be smart, you have to choose one of the four choices. What is the best of the four choices? And if you're the kind of kid or human who says, look, I don't think any of those choices are right, or I think a combination of those, if you're trying to use the cliche thinking outside the box, you end up not testing very well. And so we sort of atrophy those imagination muscles,
Yeah.
when really the great, great people are people who have somehow learned to, in spite of that, think about things that couldn't happen, couldn't be possible. You think of Steve Jobs saying, we're going to all
Right.
hold a computer in the palm of our hands,
Right.
and everyone going, you're crazy. What, or,
Yeah.
who would ever want a computer in their house? Nobody's ever going to want that. And much less
Yeah.
who would ever want to carry a computer around with them all the time? It's impossible. So
Well, isn't it true though that Einstein said that imagination was more important than knowledge?
yes, exactly. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'd
And
I'd love you to say a bit about the evidence. I mean, I think it's proven that a lot of innovation, and that's of course what our conference is
mhm,
about. A lot of innovations in science in every field have arisen simultaneously in different parts of the world, and
yeah.
that has suggested that there's some kind of field that we're tapping into, and I'm
hmm
pretty sure it's going to take the imagination to do that.
Yeah, a lot of imagination or innovation or ideas are not, they're not verbal. They're not coming from the logical, linear domain of our mind. They're coming through images and through almost a pre-verbal or um, metaverbal place. And so there are great anecdotal stories of, let's say, the person who invented the sewing machine, who was sort of really trying to figure out how the heck am I going to get the needle to go through the fabric on a machine. And he finally realized he had a dream about being in an indigenous culture, and they had spears. They were coming after him with spears, but there were holes at the end of the spears. And when he woke up, he said, oh, the hole for the thread has to be at the end, the sharp end of the needle, not the other end of the needle.
Uh-huh.
And that's what ended up happening. So there isn't a whole lot of science on imagination. There is some, and we know that there are aha moment ways of learning, and then there are the more linear, logical, structured ways of knowing.
Yeah.
But there hasn't been a ton of research on how those happen, again, because imagination has been sort of like, we don't want to talk about that. That's not real learning.
Yeah.
There is actually some evidence, for example, that there was a question about whether homework was actually important in middle school and high school. And there's some very interesting evidence showing that homework is much less important than many people would think it was, because the kind of knowledge that you need for something like algebra doesn't come from practicing it over and over and over again. It comes from having the concept lodge itself in your mind. And once it actually lodges itself, it's more like this aha moment of learning, where it's much better to kind of do work in the classroom and then talk to your professor while you're doing it than to go home and practice it by rote. So there's some evidence there. What you were referring to earlier is some interesting, tantalizing scientific evidence that when people imagine things at the same time, or when they pay attention to something at the same time, or direct their intention towards something at the same time, there seems to be sort of a crowd effect on physical reality, and certainly on problem solving and innovation. And so that's another really interesting aspect of how we can focus our internal state on something and have external results. Something that's always captivated me about the work that I did at the Institute of Noetic Sciences and other places is this idea that it really is often about a change in the state of mind that's the most important aspect of changing society. Like right now, we actually have the technology to completely power our world with renewable energy, to get food and water to everyone on the planet, to clean the oceans, to restore CO2. Technological innovation needs to continue. But
Yeah.
the fact is that we have technology now that would allow all of that to happen. And so it's not really the external world that needs more work. It's people's internal consciousness or worldview around these things. It's very difficult for people to imagine, for example, what might be alternative options, and that there is a realistic, believable, achievable future that could be short term. And once people start to imagine that and start to believe it, and we literally capture the imagination of the masses, that's when those changes are going to happen. So we should be investing just as much time and energy and resources and funding and science into what changes people's mental states and moves them into a place where they can imagine a different future, as we are in the
Yeah.
technologies that will solve these problems.
Well, I totally agree. And it's kind of a, two-sided coin, because what you're saying is so hopeful. It's so exciting to know that these resources are here and the technology is actually present
Mm.
to really tackle some of these major problems. And yet we're so stuck. And I want to go to your intensive at the workshop, because your title is Imagination Station Tools for Getting Unstuck. And
Hmm.
I want to read one line from your little blurb on that, which is on our website at anpconference.com. And the conference is in Seattle, March 21st, 22nd. But here's something you said in your little blurb here. You'll take home a few tools to shake things loose when you feel stuck, and reorient to the source of your inspiration and your larger purpose when you get distracted or lost. Come ready to play. I love that. That's such a compelling invitation. Say a little more about what we'll be doing in the intensive with you.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I think can be really useful is when we're working on a project, or we're trying to figure out something in our personal life, or when we're working on something major for society, there are ways that we can harness what we know about neuroscience, what we know about social science, to facilitate shifts in perspective. And in a way, that's really what we're talking about, is shifting perspective. So one example would be the ability to shift your aperture on a problem that you're working on. So to be able to zoom in very closely to the issue, which is where most
Mhm.
of us get stuck when we're really wrestling with an issue, and then
Right.
to open up your field of vision. So you're almost very literally in your mind taking a bird's eye view, looking at it from a much bigger distance and seeing what it looks like from there, or seeing what it looks like from the future. So one example exercise would be 10 years from now, looking back at the decision or problem that I'm trying to work on now, what would I be able to tell a friend about how I worked through it? So you imagine yourself
Mhm.
speaking to a friend and saying, I was really wrestling with this issue, and in the end, my breakthrough came from XYZ. My next steps were ABC. These were the challenges that I faced. This was the support I needed. This is what facilitated me to get through it. And imagining yourself in the future, telling someone else about how you got through it, all of a sudden you have these aha moments about, right, that's what I need to do. So changing your perspective
But do you
time-wise.
think, yeah, do you think it's possible in that kind of imaginative exercise that, just reflecting on the quantum field a little bit, that we're imagining, but maybe we're also perceiving? I
You
mean,
never
time isn't
know.
limited.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it's really great to intentionally play with time. who knows, maybe some aspect of your future self is talking to you when you do that, and you're actually asking that future self to give you a little heads up here about what the next direction is. There's also some very interesting far out projects happening where people think about talking to themselves in the past and seeing if
Mhm.
when they do an intervention in their imagination in the past, does it actually change their present? In other words, are
Yeah.
you maybe psychologically you're just doing it, but also maybe in some very real and strange way that we don't understand,
Yeah.
you're doing something that changes the present by, intervening on yourself in the past.
Well, it's going to really be a challenge for me at the conference because I'm going to want to be in the room for that, and I'm also presenting my own intensive at the workshop.
Oh,
But
I
I
wish I
think
could come to yours. What are you presenting, Will?
I'm going to talk about time travel.
Oh, well, there you go. Yeah, well, you're right. We're right on the same line.
But
Yeah,
I
I mean,
think I really want to underline the value of what you're presenting because there are so many earnest people who are really getting increasingly depressed and discouraged
mhm,
with the state of the world. And I think the domain that you're working in and the tools, as you say, that you're going to give people for getting unstuck
mm.
doesn't just give us hope, it gives us tools, as you're saying, for actually doing something using our imagination. I think that's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. And I also think this has real societal relevance. One of the
Mhm.
programs I've taught is called How We Change and Why We Don't. And it's for change makers who are working on societal issues. And one of the very simple tools I use in that program is that when you are trying to change something in society, let's think about climate change behaviors or prison reform or, civil rights, tons of these issues that we all really care about. um, Most of the time we spend about 90% of our time talking about the problem to people, and we spend about 10% of our time talking about a potential solution, when what's really
Right.
more compelling is if you can spend about a third of your time describing the problem, about a third of your time
Mhm.
describing the solution, and a full third of your time um, telling a story or introducing a narrative about a
Mhm.
believable future where when the solution is implemented, what is your vision for the future? And if you
Mhm.
think of
Mhm.
the truly great leaders in these domains, Martin Luther King Jr. or JFK, and you go back to their speeches, they spend most of their time talking about a vision for the future of how things could
Right.
be and the way
Right.
they moved things forward and made what seemed like impossible things at the time actually happen, was that they
Mhm.
inspired and captured the imagination and the hearts and minds of people, because people could, if they couldn't see that future, they could at least feel it. And that
Well,
feeling,
that I think is the key is they could feel it because all of
yeah,
those men and women you mentioned were so engaged in their vision
yeah,
emotionally, and they were able to entrain people into the feeling of what it would
yeah.
be like to, accomplish that. And I think that's what got them to adopt the vision of a leader as their own.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, when you have a fully developed imagination and you can see your vision and you're aligning your actions and intentions with that vision, other people will somehow, it's almost like a contagion or a transmission. They might not be able to see the vision clearly yet, but they can see it through your vision. And once they start to capture their own vision, then it's almost unstoppable.
Well, we're really looking forward to sharing your vision at the conference, Cassandra, which is in Seattle, March 21st, 22nd. And there's a lot of great information on it on the website, anpconference.com. Yeah, imagine you're talking to someone on the website who's, surfing around and they see your face and they read your
Mm,
bio and they're interested in coming to your intensive. Give them an invitation, kind of give them a sense of
mm.
what they'll be walking into, just briefly, but I think people would really like to know.
Well, I'm really looking forward to speaking at the Architects of the New Paradigm Conference, and especially looking forward to the presentations of several of my colleagues that'll be there. If you come to my workshop, I think that you'll have a wonderful time opening your mind to new ways to access imagination, to have tools that you can take home with you that can kind of shake you loose from habits of mind that keep us from being able to see new possibilities, and not only for yourself in your own life, but for the work that you're doing to make a positive difference in the world. I think imagination is a key and core competency, not sort of a cherry on top of the ice cream sundae or a luxury for you to engage in when you have time. So let's bring it back into a central part of how you learn, how you work, and how you are of service to the world. And I'm looking forward to playing with you on that topic.
Well, thank you so much, Cassandra, for being on line here for a few minutes. And I really look forward to meeting you in Seattle.
All right, see you there too. Looking forward to it.
Okay. Bye now.
All right, bye-bye.